Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Ben, and this is an explanation for my Stephen King project. Earlier in the year, back when I made a video about my 2024 booktube goals, I had mentioned that I am endeavoring on my Stephen King project, where I want to read through Stephen King's books, at least the ones that I own. And I thought that this kind of project maybe needs just a little bit of a preamble. I always have a lot of writing projects going on. I don't usually make dedicated videos regarding them, but this one is a little bit more, I guess, a little more focused than some of my other projects, and there's a little bit more of a definite road ahead. So, thought I would just discuss it a little bit. So I guess the first thing to discuss is why Stephen King? Why have a project about him? Well, or reading project about him, I guess, just to be more specific. Uh, when I was growing up, I was born in 1981, and I was always a monster kid. I always loved horror. I've been a lifelong horror fan, especially I would specify horror film fan. Even today, for quite a few years now, I've been co-hosting a horror movie discussion podcast called the HORRORCAST. I watch horror movies constantly. It is still my favorite genre, and I read a lot of, or occasionally, I read horror studies as well. It is a genre that I love and I take very seriously. And when I was growing up, Stephen King, I mean, his name was synonymous with horror. I mean, he was horror. That's the name that I knew before I knew film directors or filmmakers or anything like that. He's the name that I recognized. Everybody knew who Stephen King was. And I remember being fairly young and growing up. I grew up in a townhouse, kind of like a glorified condominium. And the condominium complex that I grew up in, it was like an L shape. And I was kind of, our house, or our townhouse was kind of around this point of the L. And all of these townhouses had back sliders that opened up into this very large kind of backyard. And we had neighbors that were kind of over on this part of the L. There was an adult woman with her mother, and they lived there, and they were also huge Stephen King fans. And I was young. I was in elementary school, but I just remember, every so often they'd kind of let me go inside their house and just stare at their wall of Stephen King books. And it would just be something I would look at and wonder. And I grew up watching Stephen King movies, of course, and different adaptations, seeing things like Carrie and The Shining, usually edited for television, but they showed those things on television quite a bit. But also things like Cat's Eye and Creepshow. Whenever something new Stephen King came out, I was sure to go and see it as quickly as I could, rent it or I'll see it on television. And of course, this created a fascination with Stephen King, one that has endured for the most part. When I was in middle school, I finally read a Stephen King book, and that was this copy of Pet Sematary. So it was either seventh or eighth grade. I'm not entirely sure which one, but I just remember sitting in the morning in homeroom class, and every single day I would just read more and more and more, and I just fell in love with this book. Now, years went by, a long time went by before I really started reading Stephen King again. I've been, for most of my life, I've been a reader, not as dedicated as I have been in the past, maybe 5 or 6 years. But I was always reading. However, I've said this on my channel before, most of my reading, the majority of my reading, even today, is nonfiction, especially nonfiction history. And there were many years where I didn't really read any fiction at all. So when I did read Stephen King, I was actually reading his nonfiction works. I read Danse Macabre, of course, to hear his insights into the horror genre and horror films, at least up to the very early 80s when that came out. I also read his memoir on writing, because I was also doing some of my own fiction writing as well, and that was just a fun memoir. I really enjoyed that. And then probably around 6 or 7 years ago, I finally got back into trying out Stephen King's fiction again. Again, that's a long dry spell. We're talking, over 20 years from one Stephen King fiction book to to another. But I just want to reiterate, even though I'm a huge horror fan and I was watching a lot of horror films, I wasn't reading a lot of fiction at all. And I've been getting fiction back into my reading cycle the last few years. At least like once a month I try, or at least one book a month that I read, I try to have it be fiction, but it's not always a guarantee. But I did, about 6 years ago, read it, finally, and I really enjoyed it. Now, this this book that I'm holding right here has always kind of had a special place in my heart. And of course, my memories of it right now are that of like a 12 or 13-year-old. I have not read it yet as an adult. However, I do, as part of my project, plan to reread this. Now, every novel that I've read of Stephen King since, I've liked them all. But there's always been a qualifier there. There's always been little things within the book that kind of bug me and irk me. And I say that especially to think that, Stephen King, I admire for his imagination, for his storytelling ability, and especially for the stories that he comes up with and the characters. I believe that modern society, I'm speaking especially American society, I think it spills over just with the dissemination of American entertainment. But, we might not have a steady mythology as a society, but we do still have something of one. And I think that our heroes we generally get from comic books. That's where we get our heroes. But our villains, we don't get those from comic books, with very few exceptions. We get them from horror films. I mean, these make up our villains and our monsters. This is where our nightmare landscape is. There's a few exceptions in comic books. The Joker, Thanos, they have their day. But nobody touches the kind of villain realm, I think, like horror does. And Stephen King has added more to that villainous pantheon than any other writer. I mean, if I just say names like Annie Wilkes, Jack Torrance, Pennywise, Christine, Cujo, for so many people, even if they're not avid readers, just from the film adaptations, they will have a sense of what I'm talking about. They will know these monsters. So Stephen King, I have a huge respect for as far as his ability to come up with a premise and to create something that feels relevant and lasting and that enters our culture as though it feels like it was folklore that was almost always there. It feels like it's always been a part of our society once it enters it. Now, that being said, I am not blind to the shortcomings of Stephen King's writings. And I'm not going to get into all those during this video at all. But just to say that, again, I read this as a middle schooler. Every book that I've read since from Stephen King, I've liked, but I've always had some issues with. So I am not coming from a place of adoration for Stephen King for every single book or his writing style necessarily, but I do have a deep respect for him. And as somebody who is a dedicated student of and lover of the horror genre, because of the major impact that he has had on that genre, and believe me, I like a lot of Stephen King adaptations as well. Some of my favorite films, horror films, Carrie, The Shining, Misery, and Christine, and many others, I owe to him. So I am going to be reading these books, but I do not expect to necessarily fall in love with every single one. So I would not go so far as to say that Stephen King is my favorite writer, but I have a huge admiration for the man, nevertheless. So just getting back to a little bit of my reading history. I read it about 6 years ago or so, and I really liked it. Again, there were some issues. We all know about that one scene towards the end especially, but what struck me about Stephen King in that sense especially was his ability to create a sense of place. I think that Stephen King, from what I've read so far, is at his best in the setting. My favorite character in it was Derry Maine. I love the way that he was able to construct a place that felt real, to create the geography and the history. I just thought that was absolutely stellar. That was my favorite part, actually, about the book. And then after it, that's when I kind of decided, I want to start reading Stephen King in publication order. And that's when I then read Carrie, which I think is a great first novel. It's the first one they published. Again, I have some qualifiers there. And I have to admit, I kind of like De Palma's film a little bit better than the book, but I still think it's a really good book. Then Salem's Lot, which I think we see the spark of Stephen King in his ability to create place, because Salem's Lot was also, the town itself was also a great character. And I really like that book. It's one of my favorites so far, aside from, of course, Pet Sematary, and I really like it. But even then, there's little things that that bugged me a little bit when it comes to Salem's Lot. And then, of course, you've got The Shining. I read that, and again, same kind of thing. I love so much of that book, but there are certainly some things that irritate me a little bit. And last year, I finally got around to reading Night Shift. And amidst that whole kind of sequence of reading over a few years, I did also get in a reading of Cycle of the Werewolf, The Gunslinger, and also his little novella Elevation, can't speak. So I've read those as well. Now, of course, like I said, I read Night Shift last year, but always looming in my path, I knew was the behemoth of The Stand, which you can see right over here on the shelf behind me. And that's, I think, one of the big reasons that I never went further with the project. And of course, over the last few years, a lot of life has happened. I've been busy. I was reading other things for booktube. We did move houses. But at this point, my office is shaping up to be the way that we want it to be. My wife's desk is over on the other side, so she shares the space with me, but she approves of everything that's on here. And we're kind of settled in, and I have this shelf here, these bookcases here and over here. These represent my TBR. These are my TBR shelves. After I finish reading books, you can actually see this little stack of books right here. These are some that I have finished that I haven't made videos about yet. When I finish a book, I put them downstairs in the downstairs library. So I like to see these shelves in flux. I like to see books come off and other ones come on. And, we haven't been in this house for that long, not these shelves, but it's already struck me of how stagnant this shelf is, the Stephen King shelf. I want to see it start moving, start taking off taking off books, making space, putting some more in. So I'm going to go forward with this project, starting in March with The Stand. March in BookTube world is also home to a pretty popular event, March of the Mammoths, where people at least begin to read a book that has been on the shelves that is over 800 pages. And The Stand is one of my mammoths that I've been staring at for a long time. So I'm finally going to get that down, and I expect that to get the ball rolling. Now, I'm not planning on reading a Stephen King like each month necessarily. I do want to read at least one Stephen King every quarter of the year, so every 3 months. And hopefully more than that, but at least that. So I get I will be pushing through or working through these books. And my project is not like a lot of other people's booktube projects that I've seen online. They're Stephen King projects. I've seen a lot of people, a lot of great booktubers who I admire, who I like a lot. A lot of them have dedicated themselves to reading every single book by Stephen King in publication order. I don't necessarily have the ambition nor the desire to do something like that. So I am committed to reading every single book by Stephen King, roughly in publication order that I own. So if I own it, I am going to read it. I am going to be picking up some Stephen King books along the way, but only if I really find an interest for it. So some books that I know I'm going to be looking out for, and if I see them at a used book sale for a cheap price, and if they're in good condition, worth buying, I will pick them up. And those books include, I know at least, 11/22/63. I definitely want to get that. I want to get Revival. I want to get, I think it's The Outsider. I believe that one's called. So those are some books that I'm going to be on the lookout for when I go to library book sales this summer. So anyhow, what I plan to get through this month, I want to get through The Stand, The Dead Zone. What have I got next to there? Yeah, Cujo, Different Seasons, and Christine. So those are the ones that I definitely want to get through this year, and then just continue to move forward. And I might even reread Pet Sematary this year as well. We will see if I get to that. Now, I will show you these shelves at the end of the video. I'll just tag another video onto the end of this where you can see at least the spines up close, and you'll see the different books that I am looking at to get through. But yeah, if you have any favorite Stephen King books, I'd love to hear what they are. If you have any thoughts on Stephen King, even if you hate him, at least maybe let me know why. Like I said, I would not say I'm a dedicated fanboy necessarily, but I certainly do admire what Stephen King has done for the horror genre. So, yeah, that's it. That is my Stephen King project. Hope everyone's doing well, and thank you, BookTube. Okay, well, there he goes. So here is my bookcase for basically my fiction TBR bookcases. And over on the right here, I have my horror books. And this, of course, is where I keep my Stephen King books. So if we just look really quickly up here in the paperback section, I have Lacey's Story, The Green Mile. I also have mass market paperbacks of The Dead Zone, Four Past Midnight, and Needful Things. But I also own Needful Things in a hardcover. So if we go through the hardcovers, I have The Stand, which I'm going to be reading in March, Cujo, Different Seasons, Christine, The Talisman, Skeleton Crew, Misery, The Tommyknockers, The Dark Half, Needful Things, Gerald's Game, Nightmares and Dreamscapes, Dolores Claiborne, Insomnia, Rose Matter, Desperation, The Regulators, and then down here, I've got Cell, Duma Key, Just After Sunset, Full Dark No Stars, Mr. Mercedes, and Bazaar of Bad Dreams. So I will eventually be getting through all of those books. For 2024, what I would like to get through definitely is The Stand, Cujo, Different Seasons, Christine, and finally, The Dead Zone. And now he wants to get out.